Yeah, thanks for coming along to this talk around conflict. And hopefully we're going to not just talk about our experiences with conflict within projects, but we'd love to hear from you about where it materializes, how it affects your projects, and what you're going to do differently, perhaps after hearing other people's opinions. There we go, conflict. Why are we even bothering to talk about it? So from my perspective, conflict, and if you think about business and what we're trying to achieve all the time through projects, is we've got one side of the business just trying to merrily get on with everything they do every day, right? 100% occupied, utilized. And then on the other side, we've got all these people, project professionals like us, trying to make change happen, trying to take the business to another place in the complexity of the world around them, and we're trying to mesh these two things together. That's one element of conflict, just these two sides of business trying to come together. The second one is actually even within the project, and I see this myself every day, we've got a whole bunch of teams that are trying to come together to achieve an outcome. We're trying to create alignment for them, but actually, again, it's probably not all the be-all and end-all of all the things they're doing. So there's two key places where we see conflict, and actually it's really critical. If we want the business to succeed as a whole and move forward and grow, then actually we engage and we uncover these and we try to deal with them positively. So that's why Olivia and I have come up to kind of talk about them. But we wanted to ask you, I don't know if you want to do this?
Yeah, so we just wanted to ask you, in your experience, either in your own organisation or if you go out and work with different clients, how do people handle conflict? And actually, do you resonate with these three characteristics that Ket and I have identified in our own worlds? So, A, are the kind of people who just let it go. Don't want to talk about it, don't want the hassle, don't want to be seen as being difficult, so I'm just going to let it go. Anyone seen those people?
Raise your hand. Nice and really high. I'd say it's about a third.
It's quite high, quite high.
Yeah, pretty high.
We've then got the other end of the spectrum, jumping over to number C there, ball in a china shop. Absolutely go in, all guns are blazing, don't really care, just going to say what I've got to say, and I'm not too worried about the output.
How many people see that? Actually, that is, wow, okay. That's a lot, way more than 50%.
Quite a lot.
Oh.
And then we've gone for a bit of a middleman here, so picking the battles. Sometimes might let it go, sometimes might be a ball in a china shop, and sometimes might manage it a little bit better, might be that little middle ground. Seeing them people in organisations. And we're not saying there's just three types of people, that would be a very linear way to look at it. I'm sure there's lots of different types of people, but we thought here, you know, we're just recognising that actually people do handle conflict in different ways. We've called out three here, and there's loads of other ways, and actually which one do you identify with on a personal level as well?
And I think the other thing we always got to think about is there's kind of how do we handle conflict, which one of these are we typically, but then actually as an observer to an organisation, and we're watching people kind of come together and try and achieve outcomes, how do we recognise how other people handle conflict and how does that affect the rest of the team? So it's sort of these two dimensions that we kind of come across. Now Olivia and I kind of work in change, both of us. I'm a volunteer for the Change Management Institute. If you haven't seen what we do, we're a professional body. But the other thing is I'm a business change manager for an organisation called Marlowe Consulting. My focus when I think about conflict is really around that inefficiency of a project working together. Now, and I think of this as a risk mitigation strategy, right? Like when we're all staring at a problem and no one's saying the thing that's going to really kind of reignite the conversation to solve the problem and we all let it go, then all of a sudden we carry a bunch of risk that we're not going to be able to do anything about because we haven't identified it as a group, and therefore it could materialize later on. And I see this time and again where people are in a room, they're talking about something important, but someone isn't willing to challenge what's being said. And I often ask myself, why does that exist? Why does that happen? And what does it take for someone to be that person and ask the difficult question? Because that is where we can make a project continue to be successful, and we can hold to timelines or we can adjust them and then we can manage people's expectations. So my kind of background is in that area of trying to make projects be more successful. But Olivia, you've got a slightly different take on it.
So I work for a small consultancy called Continuous Improvement Projects, and I specialise in process improvement. So my angle in terms of seeing that there might be a bit of friction, uncovering that, is that when talking around processes, something's obviously broken, not quite working. It might be the people side of it, process side of it, system side of it. And for me, I've been in many rooms where there is that elephant in the room. Something's going wrong, but no one really wants to talk about it because it's too awkward, and actually I think it's Steve's fault in the corner, but I'm not going to say that in this meeting room because I don't want to think I'm being difficult, but Steve also thinks it's someone else's fault. So you're in those uncomfortable situations, but from my opinion and my observations and why we're talking about it today is if you don't address that and if you don't bring it out into the open and then really sort of have that open and honest discussion and work through it, then you're never going to arrive at a solution that would work for the business, because if you're surrounded by people that don't disagree with you, people that don't debate with you, and you're surrounded by a team of people who just say yes to everything, you're never going to get that creative solution. You're just going to get the first solution, which might not actually fix what you're trying to fix. So for me, conflict and addressing the elephant in the room is about bringing that uncomfortable topic out, talking it through. And then we've got some, not to spoil the whole slide deck, but we've got some slides later around what you then do in that situation to move past it to get the best outcome.
And we've kind of talked about two key things that we've come across, but I want to just make sure, has anyone got kind of another scenario for conflict where they think, actually, it's not covered by either of those from their work? Because we're kind of keen to, we've got one just there and just here. Lovely, thanks. Inaccessible, right in the middle.
We could just throw it. Health and safety.
Yeah. You could, yeah.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes.
I think it's taking what can be seen as conflict, and by that I mean quite an emotive situation, and taking the emotion out to actually make it become a really decent debate.
Yeah.
Because I think people, have I ruined your...
No, you haven't ruined it at all. It's exactly... Yeah, come on. Come join us.
I think people react differently to really good, healthy debate and quite an emotive... What we're all picturing, which is the shouting and throwing plates conflict.
Yeah. No, I think we will come on to that, because when we presented this previously, and we did hone in on this idea of conflict, but we want to talk about this whole area of uncomfortable conversations and wherever they arise. But you're right, it is more than just two people going at each other. There's something behind the reason that they're going at each other, and we're trying to want to explore that a little bit more. I think there was a question back there as well, or an observation. You could, go for it. Go on. Hierarchy. Yep. Yeah. So
The end.
Good timing. So yeah, the hierarchy, that I mean, you see that a lot, especially in your kind of area of innovation. The biggest personality kind of dominates the conversation.
Yeah, I think actually, I mean, this is a conference talking around change, right? So if something's changing, a lot of the time it's because something's not working, and that's where you get your emotions, because is it me? Is there something I'm not doing right? Or do people think it's me and I'm going to become, the person criticised? And actually, when you're talking about something that's broken, it's emotional, and then that's amplified when you have that hierarchy there. It's like, well, who's going to get the blame? And what we're talking about today is around actually taking that emotion out of it, as you say, and removing that blame culture, so you don't have the hierarchy in that room of you're going to get in trouble or it's not going to be my problem, because it can't be, because I delegate everything. So around breaking that down and removing those obstacles that make conflict so much harder.
And I think we see that ego piece both equally in kind of an innovation space as well as a kind of just project like alignment and execution. But yeah, it definitely is emotion driving it, and kind of being able to kind of handle that sensitively. Anyway, probably good to have a little discussion around what we mean by conflict.
What actually is conflict? So we've got two definitions here, which we took off the interweb. The one on the left is quite a factual discussion here. So it's defined conflict as any workplace disagreement that disrupts the flow of work, quite simply put. So that's quite to the point. Doesn't really sort of go into too much around emotions, whereas this one over here defines conflict as a struggle that results when one individual's concerns are different from another person's. So you've got one that kind of puts conflict into the context of work, and you've got one that puts conflict into the context of individuals, because that's where conflict arises, isn't it? It's when there's emotions and there's different personalities. But what we found interesting here is what we'll actually come on to around, is conflict a good or bad thing? Because as Ket sort of referred to when we spoke about it the first time, there was then a really great debate around, well, does conflict mean confrontation or any other things, which I'm not going to get into because I'm going to ruin our next slide. So we looked at some stats, and 85% of employees experience some kind of conflict. So it's very common. Put your hand up here if you've experienced some kind of conflict in your workplace.
That's easily.
Probably about 85%, I'm going to go with.
Yeah. It's pretty close.
Brilliant, yeah. So it's a problem for everyone.
Yeah. And so if it's such a common problem, like what are some of the outcomes of that, right? And we picked this up from the same study, just looking at some of those common things. So like if you think of the really functional definition, I think of like senior people going like, this is just inefficient, this is not working for me, we're not getting stuff done quick enough. Which is a large proportion of like where you see like, lets the conflict escalate, these are kind of some of the issues that come up, and avoids kind of being involved in these discussions. So if you've got your sort of ego in the room, you're just going to back down from trying to be part of them, right? But it's still going on. On the other side, we've kind of got actually the extreme where people go, I just can't work in this environment, and I actually don't want to be here anymore, and I'm going to leave. Right? They've got incredible insight to what's going wrong, but they won't voice that insight. And instead, what we see turnover. And it's a significant amount. And if you think about, actually, I want to bring in now this idea of quiet quitting, right? Like, because what I think of, has everyone heard of quiet quitting to some extent, right? The idea that you just come to your work and do the bare minimum is what it's kind of largely described as, right? And I think, okay, most people come to work to do a good job for the hours that they're expected to do. And actually, the one area in business where you need people to go above and beyond is actually within projects. How many times have you gone to an impacted user who's working already 110%, right, and asked them, hey, by the way, could you just listen to this presentation I've got about the changes that are going to come? And could you also do the work at the same time? It's such a common area where we kind of go into this kind of what we'd call discretionary effort, right? What do I get to choose to spend my additional time at work on? And yet, if we don't handle these conversations well enough, what do? We have these sorts of outcomes. And actually inefficiency in the project delivery, as well as the kind of just ultimate people leaving the firm. And then people just avoiding coming to work. Actually, that's easy, right? Now we can just work from home and get something that automatically moves your mouse on the screen. Easily eBay, you can buy that apparently from Amazon now, which is good. Something else I can buy from Amazon. So yeah, it's an amazing amount of frequency that it happens at. But this we thought was really interesting as a discussion point. And
so 12% of people in this survey say that they see conflict frequently among leaders. So first question, does anyone have anything they want to say about this stat? Any interesting observations? Got one? Just at the front here.
In my previous role, two departments were constantly fighting with each other. That there were some questions the staff had, and the answer was within these departments. But because they were fighting so much with each other, we couldn't even go to the departments to ask the question if I'm from the opposite department, because it was sort of for them to. I don't know how to explain, like a sign of...
They had to make decisions by the sounds of it, and...
No, it was like they weren't how they were supposed to be if they send their own staff to the opposite department to ask a question. Like there's
almost like a known disagreement or tension between the two teams.
Yes.
Yeah.
And the work was never done because there was constantly conflict going on, and there was like within the first 6 months of my history in the organization, 50% of the staff left just simply because of this.
Wow. And just going back to this stat, do you think there was visible conflict between the leadership teams of those two sides?
Yeah, I was feeling so deeply. I mean, I left the company.
So this seems low, right? Like only 12%.
For me, 12, because of the experience I had, 12 for me is very little.
And just out of curiosity, I heard a lot. There was a lot of nod. I heard a lot of nods, moving your head really vigorously. Sorry, you point here.
I believe that percentage is quite low because if you're quite senior, you tend to be seen as you have to be professional. You can't really let it all out and have that conflict. Hence, obviously, the percentage is quite low.
Yeah. Anyone else think that that's a good number or a bad number? Happy to have a...
I think that's really low.
Yeah.
So if I have a pet project and you've got a different one, we've instantly got a conflict.
Yeah.
But that's in the room, that's in the moment. To something that might be, I want to quit my job over, is enduring.
Yeah.
So this could be way too low.
And again, it's people's perceptions of what's going on. Like, and is visibility of it important or not? Like, they're the two things we're sort of almost like we couldn't decide whether this is good or bad until we had a conversation from different people's experiences. But sorry.
Yeah, I think one of the other reasons that might be quite low as well is that I think there's a difference as well between that kind of creative conflict, honesty, really battling through ideas and creative differences that is a necessity among leaders, and then the kind of destructive kind of conflict. And I think sometimes it can be really difficult to see the difference, but there is a crucial qualitative difference. And I think that's why those numbers might feel different.
Absolutely. And I think initially when we were first discussing this...
That's all right, go.
Oh.
just one worryingly low was my comment for two reasons. One is it kind of makes me worried there's a bit too much groupthink going on amongst the leaders. And the other is that they are not modelling the behaviour that there should be happening further in the rest of the organisations. Two worrying reasons.
Absolutely. And I mean, one of the things that we were thinking is if you get asked this question, do you see conflict frequently among leaders, what does your first thought go to? Is it, oh yeah, actually, I remember they were having a row this one time, or is it people then thinking a bit more outside the box and saying, actually, there is conflict, but it doesn't always have to be that negative, as you've just alluded to there, that sort of negative conflict that just doesn't really achieve anything. So actually, as a group, although please disagree, please conflict if you disagree, 12%, far too low, because actually this is probably focusing on 12% of leaders have probably had a visible row. Probably a bit more realistic. And actually, in terms of organisational conflict and going back to probably the functional definition in terms of differing opinions that disrupt the flow of work, that's got to happen day to day, surely, in every organisation between every team. So, yeah, seems particularly low.
Yeah, and I think that point around modelling, right, like showing that it's positive to have this disagreement, which is something we'll come on and talk about, but also that you can navigate it positively. That's what we're trying to get to, right? Like, we don't mean throwing stuff at each other.
And 49% of workplace conflict occurs as a result of personality clashes and egos. So thinking back to the different ways that people handle change, where you've got the people that let it go, the people that are a bull in the china shop, actually, in change, it is all about the people, isn't it? Even if you're talking about processes, a lot of the time it is the people that run a process and the people that carry out a process. So a lot of the time that there's a breakdown and there's these frustrations and conflict comes out, it is because of emotions and people being involved in that. And one of the things that I was sort of looking up about is this DISC personality profiling. So everyone's got different personality, and the DISC model basically categorises people into certain criterias or categories. So I can't even remember what they all are, so don't test me. But it pretty much models it into 4 different core criteria, and it pretty much sort of puts a model around why there might be conflict between different types of people, and it just breaks it down into a bit of a psychological understanding of actually people will react differently to change, and sort of have some self-awareness and recognise your personality type in change, and then be open to accepting other personality types in change. But would you like to disagree with me, Kat?
Yeah, and I think, so I'm a big the personality type thing's really great with me because it goes down to that idea of we can pigeonhole people into certain buckets, and then all of a sudden we fully understand how they operate, right? Like the moment you go from everybody in a room down to 4 types, and you assume that that is the way things are, all of a sudden you've lost an incredible amount of detail about the person. So this is where you and I slightly disagree about how valuable they are, and especially MBTI, which is quite largely discredited now, but and also backed up by, I hope there's no one here from MBTI or whatever, but a lot of their research is based from their own stuff. But no, the point is that, you know, you and I can have this discussion around it because, you know, we both feel it's important, but we also can share our own opinions about where we think it comes from. There's sort of very little ego. Sometimes she comes out with it, but that is what conflict is about. But what I also want to say is we kind of picked up on the word conflict, and actually there could be a whole host of words, just other words that come to mind when you think of conflict, other than conflict. What other things happen within debate? Is another one. Disagreement.
Disconnection.
Disconnection. There's a lot of dis.
Dis.
Dis. All dis words. Anything else? Disrespect.
Dissent.
Dissent. Wow, there really are dis words.
Interesting.
I wasn't expecting that. But our point is, right, so we picked up on conflict because it's sort of this thing we often see is like these people that are coming together under pressure. But there are these variations of sort of like emotional strength, disagreement, quarrel. The other thing we kind of almost disagreed around was, is it okay to say, let's agree to disagree?
I say it.
I hate
I'll hold
it.
my hand up.
I hate it. Okay, how many people
tells me
say,
off.
yeah, it's okay to say, let's agree to disagree?
Oof.
Put your hands right up just so we
Be
can see.
proud.
It's all the people on that side.
Yeah.
How does that work? Sorry, I couldn't hear. Yeah.
Yeah.
So well, let's just explore it a little bit, right? Like my feeling is, if I say let's agree to disagree, I feel like I'm giving up on the other person. I feel like I've gone, this is just not worth it anymore. We spent enough time. There isn't, for me, a level of respect about where we're coming from. So when I say it, or if someone says it to me, I feel like we haven't reached some level of mutuality in it. But
Yeah, I guess from my side of things, it's when there's a difference of opinion, but actually there is no need to have that discussion to arrive at a solution. It's okay, well, you have your opinion, I have my opinion, and what are we really going to achieve by debating over whether agree to disagree can be acceptable in the workplace?
And this is where I think, you know, sort of demonstrating the fact that there's another element to it, which is what's the overall outcome? What are we trying to achieve? Whenever there's this disagreement, whenever you see this tension between 2 or more people or groups, what do we want to happen? How do we actually want this to play out? Because that has to be conscious in what we're doing. And if we can get to a point where we're thinking, so I've got an example where just the other day, I was talking with our comms specialist about having engaged with a group of stakeholders at length about what we needed them to do. And then the milestone had moved, but we didn't know what the new date was. And she was like, we need to go out to them. I'm like, but we can't go out to them without a new date. She's like, yeah, but we need to go out to them. But we can't really go out to them without a new date. And we sort of kept coming back and forth. I said, well, okay, I'm getting a little bit bullish here. Like, I want us to do this. I want us to go out to them when we've got a new date. You want to go out to them now. You want to manage their expectation. I kind of see where you're coming from. Okay, so in the grand scheme of things, we're both working on something that is the best for the end user, not for us. Let me put my want to one side for a moment. I understand what you're saying. I think we achieved the same outcome. Let's agree to disagree. And it's that, like, you have to almost in the moment go, why am I bothering to push this point so hard? Is it for myself or is it for someone else? Is it the outcome of the project? So I find that's really kind of key with a lot of these. I don't know if you've got an example that you kind of, I can't remember, you normally have a good example, but if not, if it comes to you later. So what do we do?
What do we do to address the elephant in the room?
What do you think? Any thoughts? What have you done?
What are the benefits of addressing the elephant in the room? Why would you want to do it?
Yeah, it's just a lady here.
your conflict could be between two or more work streams that they just can't come to an agreement what that process needs to look like. So an example I used a couple of years ago was pulled everybody together into a workshop, reviewed the current process and then what was wrong about it and what we needed to do to change it.
Yeah.
And it was rather than pointing at individuals as people as, well, it's your fault or it's your fault. No, there's a gap in the process.
Yeah.
So how do we fix it? So that's how I resolved it for
So
that
it's
particular.
about buy-in. There's a buy-in to what you're trying to do as a group.
And by
right?
everybody accepting that the process didn't work because there were aspects wrong in certain departments, you got that entire buy-in from them all, and then we had a new process come out at the end of it.
Yeah.
Yeah,
really
I've got a
good.
similar example actually where I was working with a team in improving their stores management process, and everyone was really frustrated with the stores person. I felt a little bit sorry for him in the meeting actually, because it felt like everyone was saying it was his fault that stock wasn't coming in quick enough and he never communicates with the team. And in a similar instance, we broke down the stages of the process and there was no SLA in place, there was no times. He, had his own challenges, and actually when we broke it down, it became factual around the process is the problem, and actually it almost got everyone onto the same page of understanding, okay, well, it's not his fault, it's actually he doesn't have the support or the tools that he needs to be able to deliver his role effectively.
Yeah, there's one more here.
So one of the things I find is people aren't either willing or able to be in dialogue. So everyone wants to debate something. They don't actually. They've lost the skill of actually being in dialogue, of being able to have something that there are equal and valid opinions about all the way around. And I think sometimes a lot of the conflict is around people not feeling that their valid opinion is being heard.
Yeah.
Just because it's different from someone else's. So I think if you find a way that you can bring people into dialogue rather than debate, then that helps address whatever the issues are.
And I'm interested, I don't immediately see the difference between dialogue and debate. Like I would kind of almost interchangeably use those.
No, well, I mean, dialogue is about it's about intention, I suppose. So if you're debating something with someone, or you're trying to get them to see your point of view and to make a decision based that you agree with, whereas dialogue is about, understanding that there might be a lot of different professional opinions about the best solution to something, or there might be a lot of different backgrounds that people bring to a situation, and they're not wrong. So, and that's why, you want to hear from people who are against a change program just as much as they are from it, because often if they're a long-term employee, there's a few reasons that some are valid, that they disagree with it. So for me, dialogue and debate are quite different.
So, and an outcome of that, one of the benefits is really understanding all the different opinions in the room.
That's right.
And really uncovering them all, right?
Instead of narrowing it, you're expanding it.
Yeah, you're really kind of opening up the conversation as opposed to kind of going, here's how we're going to do it, and get on board, right?
Yeah.
Like, and that's, fundamentally what we're trying to create the space for is what is it that we're missing? What is it from my perspective I can't see, but you can?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. What other benefits then do you think we might have if we started to address the elephant in the room?
So I think one of the benefits is to increase psychological safety, because quite often people don't want to speak up, don't want to share something because they think their legs are going to be chopped off from beneath them. They'll feel humiliated, they might feel inadequate, so on and so forth. So one of the biggest benefits is to increase psychological safety, so people feel able to share half-formed ideas and not be shot down in flames, which often happens.
Yeah, so creating a more of an openness for ideas to be surfaced in the first place. There was a gentleman over... Sorry, I did spot you. We're going to go here because it's closer, and then we'll come round.
Very efficient.
Efficient.
I'm terribly sorry for jumping in. I just wanted to pick up on, I've managed teams where the conflict is almost like an identity or an entity in the room. It's the legacy of it has gone on years, and they wear it, it's kind of a known thing about them, and I think they would almost, in a way, it's hard to break them out of it because it's a way of life. We've always been like this. I think the importance is trying to break them from that repetitive behaviour and that repetitive thinking. But it's really difficult, and I actually appreciate your thoughts on how do you, if it's not just about one isolated conflict, but it's years worth or months worth, how you move them. Do you have to have a big session where everyone gets it out, or it's difficult?
Yeah, I think from my side of things, it's probably quite positive if there's a lot of conflict in an organisation, because it means there's different perspectives, different ideas, and going back to the creativity side of things, it means you can think outside of the box. So I guess if there's a lot of conflict happening in an organisation to the point where it's starting to have an impact on the staff engagement and a culture, then I guess it's around taking that conflict and shaping it into something that's positive, that can be productive and have an output. So if you know there's a particular topic that's going to cause a lot of debate and there's going to be lots of ideas, then I'd almost probably have a workshop but call it a solutions discussion instead of talking about the problem. So actually, we know what the problem is, we can sort of talk about the discussion, but actually what solutions can we put in place? And it becomes more of a brainstorming session where you bring out the creativity and the different perspectives rather than sort of focusing on all the frustrations again and continuously. And once you can sort of resolve a few of those conflicts collaboratively with some of the tools that we're about to tell you, then hopefully teams can see actually it's not a bad thing that I disagree with this person because we've arrived at this solution, we've been able to fix this issue. Yeah. So I think it's not seeing a lot of it as something negative, but being able to frame it in the workplace so it generates something more positive.
And just on the point around how do you start to change that perception of kind of constant frustration or conflict within the team. I think one of the things that I've found, like in service design, is a really good example where you've got lots of teams that hand off to one another. And actually over time that process becomes quite disjointed and some things don't get handed off effectively and the other team thinks that team didn't do something. So it's almost like, first of all, like what is everyone's individual problems and where do they kind of sit? So I'd argue like it's really important to have one-to-one conversations with the people that are experiencing some level of conflict and really get to the heart of where it comes from. Right? And this is true of also kind of like when you see what you'd argue is resistance to a change, right? Like you wouldn't just go, well, they don't want the solution. There's a reason somewhere behind it that is it's either failed or something for them is not going to work. So it's really important on an individual level to understand where that comes from. But it's also good for you as a facilitator when you bring those groups together to understand where those differences are likely to butt up against another. And so that you can start to precede and understand how you'll manage that. Because I think of myself, when I'm watching two teams tussle with one another, I'm there trying to be the facilitator of the dialogue, to try and make sure that it's a productive conversation. But I can only do that if I really can understand what their problem is and I can understand what theirs is and I can kind of see where some of that unproductive conversation might arise. And I have done the exact opposite of this. So just to be really clear, I have put 15 junior analysts in a room whose roles are going to be offshored, and I left them to go and have a conversation, and I had 3 people phone my boss up and say, I'm going to resign tomorrow. It was the worst thing I did. It was about 15 years ago. And I didn't think about the egos in the room and how the conversation would evolve and what people's different points were. And that for me was the biggest learning, is like if you're going to try and move yourself forward in conflict situations, you have to have everybody's understanding and you have to be a facilitator of that dialogue. And that for me is the critical thing. And that happens persistently over time as well. So it's never, you're trying to change long-formed habits, right? And that's a deep-held belief as well. So for me, there's a couple of different things you need to kind of all bring together, which is you kind of observing the conflict itself. Yeah, and there was one there.
Thank you. In terms of addressing the elephant, I was going to say sometimes we can be the elephant in the room. So it requires humility. You have to humble yourself. You have to... sorry, can I just stand up? So
yeah.
You have to humble yourself. You have to put your positions aside, your titles aside, and be able to calm down a bit and just be able to communicate. And also be transparent as well with the people. And when you're showing transparency and when you're showing humility, people will be able to relate with you. And sometimes people can't relate with leaders because they're not able to be transparent. They're not able to speak about their mistakes. So in terms of addressing the elephant, let's just look at ourselves first and humble ourselves. And then in terms of the benefits, like you said, I think the benefits would be unity. Because Olivia spoke about how conflict is good, that we have different ideas and different projects and stuff like that. So when we're able to come together, the unity of the team, we can get ideas done. No one has to leave. You know, everyone's able to work together, and we're able to produce something good.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's probably a good time to move on to what would we do differently, unless you had something else you wanted to. So we want the happy elephant.
That specific happy elephant.
Like, we don't want to remove. This is actually, someone said it earlier. Let's just get rid of the elephant. I said, I want the elephant to be there. I just want it to be happy. Like, if we all know that it's there and we all recognize it, but it's a happy elephant, we're all comfortable that it's happy, it's not going to go around destroying stuff. That, for me, is a good place to be. Right, so we're not trying to like sweep it under the carpet. We're not trying to remove it out of the room. We really want to recognize it's there and figure out what we do differently to make that a smile on that big elephant's face.
I believe next we've got the steps that we've got to.
Oh, yeah.
Go on, you do your strap line.
Yeah, so Olivia and I were talking the other day, and for some reason these words came to me, and now I like it. So courage to confront and comfort to compromise. And it came out of that, me and the comms manager having this little tussle, and I was like, why am I pushing this so hard? Actually, I'm okay. I'm okay with compromising in this situation. But anyway, they're the 4 words that really stick in my mind. And actually, great point around kind of our own awareness, right? Like for me, how do I get into situations where I can handle confrontation, either if it's myself with someone else or if I'm observing it on behalf of others? I have to have this idea that I'm sort of almost constantly going, why am I doing this? What benefit am I getting from it? And is it helping the overall mission? But like if I can't be aware of what's going on, emotionally for me, it's actually quite difficult because I can get carried away in the moment with like my point, because it's my point and it's important, right? And actually, if we really want to try and have these productive conversations, we really need to think quite deeply about what we're doing as part of it. That for me is kind of, the kind of courage bit, right?
You made a great point as well around unity being one of the benefits. And actually, in terms of both our roles within change, but also roles within an organisation, for conflict to be positive, you have to have or build good relationships with people, and you have to be able to maintain those relationships. And I read this brilliant book, which some people here might have read, called The Advantage by Patrick Lencioni. And he concluded that relationships are based on trust. So actually, you have to be able to build up trust with people to then have some more difficult conversations and actually then not shy away from those conversations because you know it's not going to ruin that relationship. And going back to, I think it may have been your point there at the back around sort of hierarchies. I remember speaking to someone once before, and he was a director in an organisation, and whenever he was talking to his team around solutions or something to change the way that teams work, he wouldn't let them leave the room until every single person had disagreed with him on one point. So he'd pretty much open up the table and say, right, I'm here for it. Disagree with me. Give me something that you want to challenge, even if it's, you should have brought lunch to the meeting or whatever it is. Probably topical around the solution, but it's about breaking those barriers down and creating that safe space to encourage people to disagree and not having that ego. If you're the manager in the room, make people feel like they can disagree with you, because going back to the point around creativity, instead of everyone just saying yes because it's too difficult to disagree and they're going to look like difficult people, if you encourage people having that discussion and debate and you're the manager and you open up that space, then that will just ripple through the business and people know it's a safe space to have that debate. And that's all about sort of building up trust and building up the relationships with the team or with your client or whoever it is that you're having that conversation with.
So I think this one for me is also kind of a reminder that why we're here. Like if I'm in a project, there is a bigger goal that we're all working towards. We're all working as teams. But actually, whenever we're trying to make a decision, is it in the greater good of what we're trying to do? So often, that's where we kind of sometimes get sidelined. We think my team's work is more important to what's being done right now, and we forget that actually it's part of a bigger whole. And actually, if you combine these 3 things to start with, right, like you're really focusing on that piece, which is alignment of a group of teams coming together to achieve an outcome. And that's what a project is, right? Like all these different knowledge bases coming together to drive an outcome. So I always think like it's really important, along with self-regulation or self-awareness, like is why I'm making this decision in the greater good? Am I making this decision because it benefits me, or am I doing it because actually it's a beneficial thing to the project? And I do think this is another area where kind of like, you see it quite frequently in like the governance of how projects get managed. sometimes we won't confront something that is like a really big thing a big change to the scope or some other decision, and we won't really push on whether it's the right thing to do. Do we accept the change? Do we carry on doing what we're doing and accept the risk? But what will happen is people won't have that greater good in mind. They'll let the idea go, and then later on the risk materializes, and all of a sudden now we're having to deal with it, right? So it's really important, like when we come across these confrontation points, we come together, we create alignment, but we also act in the greater good of what we're trying to achieve. Like, who's it for? What are we doing this for? Slightly different when you're thinking about a one-to-one relationship, but when I think about it as a project, this is where I see that conflict often most.
And the final point that was mentioned earlier today as well is around facilitating dialogue, having those conversations and just addressing it. And on a project I was working on recently, I was trying to implement a new process, which was quite a substantial change to the way that teams worked. But in terms of business priorities, it was like a compliance-related, very important thing. But there was a lot of frustrations from the teams where they had to change the way that they work. And my colleague had been quite, you've been told the process, this has to be the process. And it was met with a lot of resistance. And both personalities were really strong, really big clashes. And at the end of their discussion, the person who we were trying to get to change their approach was just completely disengaged and frankly really frustrated and didn't want to come to any more of our meetings, which was not too helpful. So I ended up setting up a call with him to have that dialogue and say, okay, well, talk to me around what your concerns are. And it was a capacity thing, which actually, in terms of what Ket was speaking about earlier, when we're delivering projects, we are asking people to kind of go above and beyond. Can you just test this for me? Can you change the way that you're working because we're trying to achieve something different or something better? So for him in particular, it was a resourcing challenge. And I took comfort in being able to compromise. So we compromised, and I said, you know what, let's not go for the end goal of what we're trying to achieve, but let's break it down into a smaller step. So let's test this with what's most important. Let's take a part of the process or a part of what we're trying to apply and just apply it for what's most important instead of doing it 100%. And if we can get from 0 to 20% or 0 to 50%, then at least we've made an improvement, continuous improvement, instead of just trying to force people to go from 0 to 100%. And sometimes when you're working in a change initiative or in a project, if you're asking someone to go from 0 to 100% and you get met with conflict, by having that dialogue, you may have to come to a point where you just have to compromise on what you're trying to achieve. And if you're not able to back down and compromise, then the conflict may just continue.
And I just want to come back to kind of a point from me about that relationship management, and where that kind of courage to confront things comes from. I was actually in a meeting about sort of 6 weeks ago where we'd spent meticulous time working with the technology team about how we were going to roll things out, and we needed a specific couple of milestones from them, which allowed us to plan how we would engage with the business. And then in the middle of a meeting, where we were just about to sort of go out with the product, they said, actually, that milestone now doesn't include the user testing. We need to add 4 weeks to that. And it was almost like a throwaway comment, and then the meeting carried on. And I was sat there for a moment. My heart was almost racing because I'm like, that fundamentally changes my whole timeline. And I was expecting someone else to pick it up, like my boss or someone to say something. And as I was sat there, my window was narrowing to say something before they'd moved on, right? So I had a choice to make as to whether to say something, and I did. And the reason I did is because of the relationship. The person that said it, I had a relationship with, I'd nurtured. And we'd worked together, and I felt like they'd almost just completely negated that, and it was important that the rest of the audience heard that we haven't done well here as a team. So we're bringing all these things together in every conversation, and for me, that is largely what we're trying to do, right? We're using our relationships to build trust. We're using that trust to be able to have conflicting conversations, and we're trying to drive aligned outcomes for projects. And by doing all of that, we bring all of these things together by just thinking about what's our role in all of that. So I think that was the cue for us to kind of start shutting up, I think.
Yeah.
So what we wanted to ask you to do, well, actually, yeah. You want to ask?
Go on.
Yeah,
You go.
well, wanted to ask you, for yourself or for your team or for your organisation, turn to the person next to you and just say one thing you're going to do differently as a result of what you've heard today to help you with managing conflict in your organisation. Go. You've got like 30 seconds because otherwise we're going to get booted off. In fact, we are going to get booted off, so go really quickly. It's not even going to be 30 seconds. It's...
Bye.
Do you want to just ask? Do you want to ask when we come back?
Anyone got, just before we physically get pushed away, anyone got anything that they wanted to call out? Yes.
Just in terms of conflict management, I personally find it really frustrating when people do bring too much ego into conflict and too much unprofessionalism. So what would you advise on how to make sure that the conversation is kept constructive to what is actually professionally required? Thank you.
I think the thing is, the thing is, it's a bit of a tricky situation, right? Like the ego comes from a place of like, their own experience, their own beliefs, their own perception of what they're expected to do in the situation. So again, I go back to kind of that self-awareness, like what is my role and how am I feeling about the person's ego, and how can I help kind of disarm that a little bit and not take personal offense to it, to try and get to the heart of where the ego comes from. So I do think, like, whenever you meet an ego, the natural reaction is for you to assume that it's aimed at your inability to do something, or that you perhaps are the reason that they are speaking to you in that way, or they want to act in that way. But it's actually got nothing to do with you. And I think that's probably, for me, one of the important things, is you've got to remove yourself from the situation and try and listen to what they're trying to do, the way they operate, what are their beliefs, and try and get to the heart of where that comes from. And then you can start to work with it a little bit. I'm conscious, are we really going to get booted out if I ask someone? Okay, cool. All right.
So, we're going to linger.
Yeah. One thing we will say, we hope we've got happy elephants now, and all of you can go and make happy elephants wherever you go in the world. Thank you so much for taking part.
Thanks,
and,
everyone.
If you want to find out more about Olivia and I, you can actually scan that QR code and you can
Technology.
add us on
Yay.
LinkedIn, and it will be in the slides as well. But thank you so much for joining us and for sharing your
Thank you.
opinion. Thank you.